Okay, so our first science conference will be on ocean alkalinity enhancement, and I'll let Brendan give you a definition of that. And then we have several talks about this, which is how you get the ocean to suck up more carbon dioxide. And Brendan works for Seacoast, which is a university in Washington. The natural and atmospheric. So he actually works out of the Pacific Marine.
Thank you, Lynn. Can you all hear me in the back? Okay, I'll try to keep this up, but as I go on, I tend to become quiet. So let me know. Okay, so I was asked to give this talk a few weeks ago, and I thought it's a few weeks down the line, no problem. It's going to be easy. And since then, I kind of ran low on time. So what I've done is I've made a Frankensteinian monster of 3 different talks, kind of glued them together, and that's what we're going to see today. The first talk is one that was aimed at kind of NOAA high-ups, and they've been trying to grapple with why they're suddenly hearing so much about MCDR and why they're hearing so much about ocean alkalinity enhancement. So this was kind of aimed at them trying to help them grapple with that. The second talk is just focused on some recent ocean alkalinity enhancement work that's wrapping up now. And then the third talk is the ongoing discussion. So the set of questions we're going to be addressing keep changing as we go. The first one is, what is MCDR? Why are we suddenly interested in it? What is NOAA doing about it? And the second set of talks is associated with what is ocean alkalinity enhancement specifically? What are some of the potential showstoppers for the method? And then what are we doing to assess these potential problems? Okay, so many of you in this room probably already have that. This is trying to answer the question of why does MCDR get its own acronym? Why is there a little M there? Why not just CDR writ large? And this is a very simple diagram showing 2 dots. The dot on the top represents the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere naturally. The dot on the bottom represents the amount of carbon that is in the ocean naturally. And the point here is very simple, is that the ocean dot is very large relative to the much smaller dot on the top. And the implication here is that anytime you're talking about carbon cycling on the planet, especially through the kind of reservoirs that are accessible on human timescales of the atmosphere and the ocean, then you have to involve the ocean. The ocean has to be part of it. And so any solution to extra carbon in the atmosphere probably have to involve the ocean in some way, shape, or form. Of course, humans have been emitting a lot of carbon, and that's these 2 little dots here. They may seem small, but the dot on the top is kind of every headline you've ever read about global warming and heat being trapped on the planet. The dot on the bottom is every headline you've ever read about ocean acidification. So these are relatively small compared to the natural reservoirs of carbon, but they're still very, very meaningful. MCDR is asking the question, well, given the relative size of these dots, it's reasonable to think that we might be able to shunt some carbon safely from the atmosphere into the ocean. And so to ask questions about how can we do that. There's other ways of just saying maybe we can, siphon off some of this carbon. That's, I think, some of the techniques you'll be hearing about later on in this semester are focused on that question. But fundamentally, it's just recognizing that the ocean plays an outsized role in the carbon cycle. So we want to really focus on that. Just want to put the dot that this is most of what I do, is trying to figure out how big that dot is and where that carbon goes and what the chemical impacts are. MCDR was not something I was doing 5 years ago. Like many people in the community, I've been swept up into this frenzy of scientific interest in it. So why are we suddenly so interested in MCDR when, 5 years ago it was a topic in science, but not one that a lot of people were pursuing? This is a figure from the IPCC 6 assessment report. It's more complicated than it appears, but the simple message is this. Look at this red line. This red line is a kind of history of our emissions to date over time, going up to 2020. And then it's a projection into the future of what our emissions, net emissions, are going to have to look like in the future in order to keep planetary warming below 2°C. And then they've carved up the kind of future part into 3 different components. And here they're saying in the green We think we can do a whole lot better than we are right now in terms of finding ways to live our lives the way we are without emitting carbon dioxide. So this is becoming more efficient and finding better ways to kind of do what we're doing. Then there's this brown portion of the curve, which is, that's the stuff that we don't think that we can get rid of. Their diagram has a little truck. I think it should have an airplane because airplanes are going to be one of the last things to be decarbonized. So we're either going to have to find an alternative to them, or we're just going to keep emitting. If we keep emitting, then we need to find a way to have negative emissions. And that's this blue section, that's MCDR. And that was the really big kind of grenade lobbed into the international discussion of, oh my goodness, not only is it enough for us to become more efficient, we need to find ways to actually start pulling this out of the atmosphere if we're going to meet our Paris climate targets. From the scientific standpoint, we are not ready to scale up to what they're suggesting, which is 20 billion tons of CO2 removal from the atmosphere by the end of this century. And so there are a lot of very wealthy companies and philanthropists that said, okay, we need to kickstart this industry. We need to find a way to make this plausible within the next 50 years or so. And the only way to do that is to just start investing in it. And so right now, there's this is the total number of sales of carbon dioxide removal that have happened over time. This is a shockingly short time span here. We're about here. This is just a couple of years ago, pandemic era. You can see that the total number of carbon dioxide removal credits has just skyrocketed during that time. This is when the IPCC 6 assessment came out with that statement. So most of the buyers are folks like Microsoft. There's a consortium of like Amazon and a couple other companies pooled their money under a Stripe initiative. And so now they've spent something like $2.2 billion on this, just buying carbon credits. So this is great in theory. We've greatly increased our capacity, or at least the number of people who are focused on this task. But I wanted to point out that we are at 6 million tons of CO2 credits sold, but we need to be at 20,000 million by the end of the century. So we still have a long way to go. And then on top of that, this is credits sold. Of these, only about 4%, 4.5% have actually been delivered. So this is just kind of people who have agreed to take on a contract that haven't yet pulled it yet. In order to kickstart this industry, the philanthropists are buying this carbon at really exorbitant prices. Right now, it's at $366 per ton, whereas our societal social cost of carbon is closer to, well, depends on who you ask, but it ranges from $5 to $190 per ton in the US. Okay, is this working? I would argue yes, in that we've put the industry on life support and the industry is responding. This is the total number of independent companies that have sold carbon dioxide removal credits over the same time span of just 4 years. So this is a really short period of time during which there's been an 8-fold increase in the number of carbon dioxide removal companies. And this is why we're suddenly kind of hearing so much about it. A bunch of new companies are forming up, starting to sell credits, and it's kind of sucking all the air out of them in a good way and also some bad ways. I'll just point out that for those of us who are focused on long-term monitoring of trends in the ocean, it's been a bit of a challenge. We've had about 20% attrition in our workforce as people kind of move on to these nascent growing companies. It's awesome. It's a really good opportunity. It's what society needs to do, but it's also a challenge. We need a lot of people like you to come in and kind of be a talented workforce. Okay, this point of this slide is pretty simple, but it was making a point to, well, the argument here is we're trying to calculate how much money there could be in carbon dioxide removal, the industry. And this was kind of talking to people from the Department of Commerce, which is why I was speaking in monetary terms. The 3 variables that I was looking at here: social cost of carbon, cost of removal, in terms of how much it costs to actually pull down 1 ton of CO2, and then the total capacity of the technique for removing CO2. This figure comes from the NOAA draft research strategy for carbon dioxide removal. And this is showing kind of independent, just rough estimates of the cost of removal on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the capacity for each technique. And then the dots represent various different carbon dioxide removal techniques. We're mostly focusing today on ocean alkalinity enhancement, which is this one. It's So the 2 points I was making here is that one, if you just plug in the numbers for ocean alkalinity enhancement that we have on this one, who knows if they're right, but if we just do, this suggests that this could be up to a more than $1 trillion per year industry. And so that's one of the reasons why there's so many people who are, getting into so much interest in this as a potential industry. The other, far more important point here is that these uncertainties, that's around $200 per ton, around $20 per ton. That's an order of magnitude uncertainty in terms of the cost of removal. And when you explore that uncertainty space, you find that it goes from being more than $1 trillion per year industry to massively not worth your time at all, this negative value added. So we really need to shrink those error bars. And that's kind of the focus of the carbon dioxide removal research that we're trying to engage in. Okay, also, I'll point out that this is why if you talk to 10 different people within our field, you'll get 10 very different answers to the question of should we even be caring about MCDI? Because they're all right within the uncertainty space, if that makes sense. Okay, during the last couple of years, we've also had a many-fold increase in the amount of funding that's available for carbon dioxide removal research. This is just 2 examples, both from the last year and a half, I think. NOPS Marine CDR call has $24 million funding 17 projects. And then DOE ARPA-E had an additional $36 million for, 11 projects. So it's an interesting time to be involved in this field. This is very NOAA focused slide. Check out our draft research strategy if you're interested. Jessica Cross did a really great job on putting it together. It covers a lot of the different techniques and shows where we think NOAA can contribute to the research that needs to be done. This is also an amazing collection of papers. This is the Guide to Best Practices in Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement. The only comment there is that that's really focused on one technique, ocean alkalinity enhancement. And so, will the rest of this talk. Takeaway so far, it could be a huge market. It could also be not worth pursuing. We don't know. We need to do research to find out more. The interest in MCDR is rapidly growing. And then I deleted the rest of the slide because it wasn't really relevant. And I forgot to get rid of this is an ellipse at the end. Okay, so moving on to the second part of the talk, now focused on what the title of the talk was. What is ocean alkalinity enhancement? How many of you, hands up, feel comfortable with the idea of alkalinity? Totally comfortable. Good. There's a lot of brave people in this class. This is awesome. Okay, so the important thing to know for the purposes of the rest of what I'm going to be talking about today is that alkalinity is the answer to the question of why does the ocean hold so much carbon? If you look at the ratio of oxygen to the carbon in the atmosphere, the ratio is about 500. If you look at that same ratio, oxygen to DIC in the ocean, that's 110. So there's just a lot more carbon than you would expect in the ocean than you would find relative to a lot more carbon than you'd expect in the ocean, period. The reason why this is super simplified, this is a kind of a net equation. It skips a lot of intermediate steps, but generally speaking, alkalinity, which can be represented as this OH minus, can react with carbon via water to form bicarbonate. And when it does, it then is able to be stable in the ocean for something on the order of 10,000 to 100,000 years. Not that individual molecule, but the excess carbon is present in ocean for that length of time. Again, that's an oversimplification. Okay, so ocean alkalinity enhancement is taking a look at this observation and saying, okay, if that's the reason the ocean holds so much carbon, then maybe we can find a way to make the ocean more alkaline and kind of encourage it to pick up even more. And there's multiple ways that people have suggested doing this. One includes taking basic minerals from land, dissolving them in the ocean, kind of increasing alkalinity the way it increased naturally. The reason the oceans are alkaline is because of all these basic minerals that are dissolved on land and washed off into the ocean. The other approach is taking advantage of the fact that humans have access to a lot of electricity and a lot of power and just trying to do it brute force. And there's 2 different ways here. Both of these are kind of electrochemical ocean alkalinity enhancement, and that's what most of my research has been focused on. That can be further subdivided into electrolysis, which is taking water and ripping it apart, saying, okay, OH minus, you go this way, H plus, you go this way. Or electrodialysis, which is saying, okay, the OH minus that is already in seawater, you go over here, and the H plus, you go over here. One way or another, what you're doing is you're taking seawater and you're splitting it into an acid stream and a base stream. The acid stream, you got to find something to do with that. For the most part, for now, while people are doing small amounts of this, the goal is to take that acid and sell it, and then displace acid that would be generated commercially via kind of some sort of carbon intensive production process. However, once we're talking about gigatons of carbon removed per year, then we need to be thinking about other things to do with that acid. Most of those involve just finding basic minerals on land and neutralizing them, neutralizing that acid to just kind of get rid of it. The important part is the base. The base you then just return to the seawater. So fundamentally what you're doing is you're pulling acid out of seawater. That's kind of the net reaction. When you do this, it has two chemical consequences on two different time horizons. So in the very short term, timescales of less than a minute, you have reaction of the base represented here as sodium hydroxide with that bicarbonate, which is the dominant form of carbon in seawater. And then it goes to form more carbonate ions. That's this one here. More carbonate ions is arguably a good thing because it's kind of reversing a process that's been happening for, since humans have started emitting carbon to the atmosphere. It goes up into the atmosphere. About a quarter of what we are emitting today is going back into the ocean. And when it goes into the ocean, it reacts with carbonate and actually diminishes the ocean's carbonate ions. So because of human emissions, we've been having plummeting carbonate ion concentrations. This, in the very short term, counteracts that and increases those carbonate ions. Longer term, timescales of 1 month to 12 months, depending upon kind of the depth of the mixed layer and the amount of wind and all that, CO2 will come from the atmosphere into the ocean, and there it can react with that extra carbonate and then go back to forming bicarbonate. So the punchline here is that when you pull acid out of seawater, two things happen. Short term, you get ocean acidification mitigation. Long term, you have carbon dioxide emission. I'm gonna take a breath. Anyone have a question?
What's that figure?
Oh yeah, this is AI art generated by Hugging Face Stable Diffusion. I was just plugging in ocean alkalinity enhancement. Show me what you got. A lot of the background art comes from that. Yeah, thank you.
Just want to make sure it's not a twofer. You don't get ocean acidification mitigation, and then you also get atmospheric carbon dioxide removal.
Yeah,
It's
that's correct. It's you don't get to have your cake and eat it too, but you do get to have your cake and then later eat it.
So is this working sort of like a buffer system?
Yeah, it should be ultimately creating making the ocean slightly more well buffered.
Okay.
Or at least increasing alkalinity.
I don't know if you're about to get into it, but has this been put into practice yet? As in, do you need to create a facility to do this and then deposit the water back in, or how would you go about doing it?
Yeah, so you would need some kind of facility. It would be energy intensive. You come in, electrodialysis requires less energy than electrolysis, but both of them require energy. You take seawater out, split it, take the acid, do something with it, take the base, put it right back in. And the facility of that could look like any number of things, but most of the ones that are being considered look a lot like a wastewater treatment plant.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going. All right, so this is a really awesome figure from carbonplan.org, where they did some you probably can't read that, it's too small. But they did some brainstorming about what are the many different ways that this could go wrong. What are all the points of failure for this? And so this is kind of a flow chart. They've got one of these for many different carbon dioxide removal techniques. So check it out, it's a really cool website. They went one step further and said, they rated each of these points of failure based upon how problematic they think it is likely to be, or at least how much uncertainty there is about this. And so the more filled squares that you see there, the more skeptical they are that this is going to work as a result of this. We took this and we're like, well, okay, let's think about the ones that we can speak to. So the rest of this talk, we're gonna be focusing on these four and none of the other ones. We're not at all able to contribute to the materials and energy, the life cycle analysis, those sorts of questions. We are interested in the places where things can go wrong when you're adding the base to the seawater. Secondary precipitation, what that's referring to is if you push the chemistry too hard, too fast, you can actually start to crash out calcium carbonate, solid mineral. That actually, well, if you do a small amount of it, it decreases the efficiency of your carbon dioxide removal. If you do a large amount of it, then you can actually even reverse it. So you actually start having the ocean degas CO2 into the atmosphere more than it would have otherwise. Biotic calcification response, we'll talk about that more later, but the idea there is if you mitigate ocean acidification, then you might encourage organisms to form more shells on the hard parts out of calcium carbonate, and that could be a negative feedback on alkalinity. Air-to-sea gas exchange, this is the idea that it takes 1 to 12 months for that water to pick up the extra CO2. If it loses contact with the surface during those 1 to 12 months, then it won't pick up all the CO2 that it could. And so then you're stuck with the ocean acidification mitigation, and you never replace that with carbon dioxide removal. I'm kind of okay with that, but the carbon bean counters would say that's a lost profit. Okay, so this was the first set of experiments that we did. This was a really simple kind of proof of concept in the laboratory setting. We went to Stony Brook University. There were 2 large tanks. We had a control tank, an experimental tank. We added the base to one and not to the other and just made sure that the chemistry was working the way we'd expect. Really cool work done by these 3 amazing people, Mallory Ringham, Julian Herding, and Christopher Keda. Skipped a step. The chemistry worked. No surprise there. This is the control in blue, the experimental in red. You can see the alkalinity immediately, the differential, there's immediate difference. We added the base, no surprise there. For the dissolved inorganic carbon, that did not change when we added it, but it took 1 to 12 months or some length of time, less than we'd expect in the open ocean because it was a relatively shallow tank. It managed to creep back up over time. PCO2 initially dropped down in the experimental tank and then later came closer together due to equilibrium or due to air-sea gas exchange equilibrium processes. This is in review right now, paper by Mallory. This also gave us, oh, I need to speak up, thanks. This also gave us an opportunity to examine some of the issues associated with the base additions to seawater. And indeed, we found that we could add base to seawater, but when you add a strong base, you immediately have magnesium hydroxide precipitation. That's this white precipitate, maybe looks like bubbles to a lot of you, but it's actually little chunks of mineral floating on the surface of seawater. That tended to redissolve within less than a minute. So we know that we can add a certain amount of base and it's okay. It will form this stuff, but then it will redissolve really rapidly. But we also, as expected, found that you can push it too far. And that for us was about a pH of around 10 with the seawater that we're working with. If we pushed it beyond that, we got runaway chain calcium carbonate precipitation and just turned the whole thing into a white milky mess. And the only thing that was limiting the formation of calcium carbonate at that point was the amount of carbon in seawater. So as more CO2 went in there, it just kept precipitating out more and more and more. So that's something that we want to avoid. And we were kind of using that to explore what the limits of that are. So that's the secondary precipitation issue, base dispersal into the ocean, those kinds of issues. We're looking at that. For the modeling component of this, we're using the Bering 10K regional model, which is, this is the model domain. We're simulating a large release of alkalinity right here at this red star and asking what that does to the chemistry, over what time scales does it re-equilibrate. This is work that was led by Hongji Wing, Kelly Carney, Darren Pilcher. Kelly did a lot of the modeling and Hongji did a lot of the write-up. In Hongji's analysis, what she found is that she was calculating, okay, how much additional carbon would we expect this seawater to hold at equilibrium, given the amount of excess alkalinity that was in the seawater because of our addition. So that's this carbon dioxide removal potential. You can see that this is being the point of release, this red dot. It was relatively small amount of carbon distributed over a very large area. It might be tough to read this number, but this is 1 micromole per kilogram. So for those of you who've done these measurements, you know that that's barely measurable. But it's spread over a large area, so it actually was the expected amount of carbon dioxide excess. Then when we asked, okay, what's the difference between what we would expect and what we found? That's this figure here. It's one in this tiny little area here, so it was initially under equilibrated. And then by the time it got out to this contour, the second contour out there was only 0.1. By the time you exited the model domain, it was gone. This is reassuring. This was after some calculation, we found that it took only about 10 weeks for it to become about 95% saturated. So for us, it was closer to 2.5 months. When we said 1 to 12 months before, but for us, it was around 2.5 months. We think the Bering Sea might be an especially good place for air-sea equilibration. It's windy, it's cold, it's relatively shallow, the water can't sink anymore. But fundamentally, our analysis suggested that that particular concern is not a major concern, at least in this domain. There are other modeling studies that have shown other results that suggest it takes longer. So take this with a grain of salt. We were interested in how much ocean acidification mitigation you could find. So this is a weird diagram, but the y-axis is the surface area of the model over which a certain threshold of ocean acidification mitigation was found. We'll ignore the blue and the red lines, just focus on the yellow line. The yellow line is a pH anomaly of 0.02. And that represents about a decade and a half of ocean acidification mitigation. So turning back the clock about a decade and a half. And the number goes from 2 to 3.5. So that represents 100 to a couple thousand square kilometers within the model of surface area that had been mitigated by that amount of ocean acidification mitigation. You can see that the line keeps dropping out. And when that happens, it meant that not even a single grid cell had that amount of ocean acidification mitigation. And so this really, the main takeaway here is just that our model wasn't quite high resolution enough, despite the fact that I was using the highest resolution model I could conceive of, which was a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer model. So this suggested that to look at ocean acidification mitigation, even with a large intervention, we're talking about a relatively narrow area over which that mitigation is going to be found. That suggested that we needed a high resolution model. Okay. When we were wrapping up these, writing the papers, wrapping everything up, we were left with some questions. The first one is, what are the chemical limitations? We wanted to get a lot more quantitative in terms of just, yeah, when you add some base, you get some magnesium hydroxide. We wanted to really kind of explore the exact kinetic limits on that. That work is still ongoing over at Stony Brook, but we've also got another project that's starting to look at this. We also never touched the biology. The first thing we did in those test tanks is we sterilized everything. But we don't really want to do that in the real world because we don't want to sterilize all this water that we're pumping through. So we wanted to actually look at what sorts of impacts increasing the alkalinity might have on the organisms that we find in nature. Also, we wanted to re-examine the question over what spatial scales could this meaningfully mitigate ocean acidification, but with a higher resolution model. We added a couple other questions. Could this be implemented using only natural seawater as an input? We somewhat cheated in our CMATE Stony Brook University experiment, where we generated the base rather than from seawater, we generated it from a brine solution because that was safer and it was better for the instrument that we're using there. So with our follow-up work, we actually wanted to make sure we can get this system working directly in seawater. We also were curious what monitoring we would need in order to show that this is safe and effective. And then the last question is, could we power this with renewable energy, which has, notoriously uneven power supply over time. That led us to the follow-on proposal. This is kind of our team of PIs. This is a team up between my institution, which is PCCO's, the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and then also our industry partner is now Ebb Carbon. Ebb Carbon formed with the technology, I think, that was originally patented by Matt under his CMATE company, which he did before. Matt is one of the many people who has kind of gone from academia into this space. I also want to acknowledge all of these amazing people. These are people who are actually getting a lot of the work done. Up top, we have our female team, including Mary Margaret. I've lost you. There she is. Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and then also Eb Carpin has a lot of folks who they've kind of shared their time and expertise to keeping this going. Our plan was relatively simple. We were going to go to Swim Bay. Our hope was to build towards this dream future where we had the system set up at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, which is next to Swim Bay. I'll revisit where that is in just a moment. We're going to pull seawater out, filter it, pass the filtered seawater onto Eb Carbon. Then we're going to make an acid stream and a base stream. Then we're going to take the base stream, put it back into the unfiltered seawater. We're going to put the product back out into Swim Bay. Along the way, we're going to make sure we do exactly what we're putting back out to Swim Bay, put some sensors out there, and then monitor the impacts within the bay itself. We were also going to model the whole area. We wanted to build to this. We knew that we wouldn't be there right away. This is the location. So we are here in Seattle. I can see. We're here in Seattle. That's the Strait of Juan de Fuca that you can see up there. The first red box is the area around Swim Bay. The middle red box is showing Swim Bay itself. And then the final one is the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory campus, which is run by Battelle on behalf of the Department of Energy. That's where our collaborators at PNNL are mostly located, and that's where we've since gotten everything set up. This is their facility. It's a gorgeous place. I suggest you find an excuse to collaborate with them, because it gets you a reason to go out there. That was the building that we've got everything set up in. So we needed a model, and we needed a model that was higher resolution than our 10K model. And fortunately, there's this existing model run by the Sailor Sea Modeling Center at the University of Washington, in collaboration with folks at PNNL. It is a FVCOM model, which is finite volume community ocean model. But the really neat thing about FVCOM is it has a flexible model geometry. So you can see out here, we have a relatively coarse grid cell. It's still much higher resolution than our Barium 10K model. But then here at Swim Bay, it gets even higher resolution, much, much higher. And so it allows us to really have high resolution where we care about it while still covering a large area without completely crushing our budget with computational burdens by keeping the whole thing high resolution. We can also further increase the resolution right near the point of release. Again, this is the PNNL campus. This is the point of release here. So we needed much higher resolution right at that neck. Okay, we've had some recent progress. This is the team that got the whole system set up at PNNL. You can see the crazy Rube Goldberg system in the background. The person in the foreground is Nicholas Ward. He's also, I think, affiliate faculty here at the University of Washington. He did an amazing job of getting everything ready for this. The Eb Carbon team also threw a lot of person hours getting the system set up. Got Mary Margaret on board. We got a tank set up. We've got a bunch of sensors set up and reporting information ongoing. So we've made some progress in recent months. However, we have not released any carbon or any alkalinity into the ocean. And that's because we want to make sure that we are ready before we do. So for now, we're actually just doing these kind of tank flow through experiments where this keeps changing what we have in the middle point, but the idea is that we're putting basically doing a bunch of laboratory experiments in a semi-flow through capacity, but we're going to a wastewater treatment area rather than out to the bay. We want to have a number of things ready to go before we actually put anything out into the bay. Number one, we need legal permits. That's important. We thought we had the legal permits. They said we could discharge pH up to pH of 9, but that apparently only meant we could accidentally discharge up to a pH of 9. When we're talking about intentionally perturbing the pH, like, oh no, that's an entirely different thing. We also need to make sure we have community buy-in. So we've been bringing in folks from the kind of local community, showing them what's going on. Nick Ward has been meeting with the Lower Elwha as well as the Jamestown Clallam tribes to kind of make sure that they're aware of what's going on, have an opportunity to express concerns, kind of figure out how we're going to do this. We also want to make sure we have the modeling so that we can say this is what we expect to see. That seems like it's an important thing to do before we do anything. And then we also want to have the species response studies that we're doing, at least mostly wrapped up, so that we can say whether or not we expect this to have any impact on the organisms. Skip that slide. Point of this slide is just to say that we've been going somewhat slowly, somewhat intentionally for all those reasons. Main thing here is that we're storing a lot of acid and a lot of base. A lot more than most labs handle routinely, and it's a very dynamic volume. So there's some really unexpected, well, probably should have been expected, steps that we need to take in terms of safety and just making sure that we have absolutely everything in a place where no one's gonna get hurt. We have contingency plans for, okay, what happens if we spill, 2,000 liters of dilute hydrochloric acid, things like that. The other issue is that there's a lot of electricity that's required. That building that I showed had to be completely rewired to supply the amount of electricity that the Ebb carbon system needs. It's kind of a messy figure. There's a lot going on, but these are some of the experiments that we have. I think maybe I'll just focus on this bottom panel here. This is the time series of alkalinity in our experimental tank. You can see it keeps coming down here. Those little dots at the bottom, that's where the water starts out when we pump it into the tank. And we add the base, and it shoots way up, and then it creeps up slowly, and that's just due to evaporation. This top panel is showing the PCO2 in various reservoirs. We'll focus on this purple line. Well, first the orange line, that's just the atmospheric value, so you can see that's relatively constant. The purple line, you can see we pump in water from the environment, it's way up high, and then it kind of just creeps down slowly. And that's just because we're pumping in very high PCO2 water, and it's just leaving that PCO2. Then we add the base, and the PCO2 goes way down, but then it starts creeping up. Well, it's creeping up because it's below the atmospheric value. It's below the atmospheric value because we've added all this alkalinity to it. And then it's just picking up more CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is us kind of cycling through various additions of alkalinity, just putting the system through its paces, making sure everything's working. Hidden in there, we've actually switched from using that brine solution that we talked about to produce our base to now we're using full seawater to produce the base. So that's one technical challenge that has been overcome. It seems like it works fine, despite our concerns about using seawater. We were worried about some of the extra organic stuff that was in seawater becoming a problem. This is just showing that the pH is doing what we'd expect. It shoots up when you add alkalinity, then slowly decays back down. This is a bunch of different experiments plotted on top of each other. We've only had one long experiment that was over Christmas this last year. And then the point of this slide is to show that when you look at the conditions from the bay where we're pumping our water out, there's huge variability in the pH, natural variability, in the pH and the PCO2. This is good and bad. It's bad in the sense that in our original dream, we thought we were going to release a little bit of alkalinity, and we were going to see the impact on the chemistry of the bay. With that amount of variability, there's no way we're going to see that impact and be able to say that's anything other than natural variability. That's the bad side. The good news is that some of our hypotheses that we want to test involve relative rates of equilibration when you start with a high PCO2 versus a low PCO2. That means we don't have to do anything to that water. We can just pump it in when it's very high or very low. The cycling that you're seeing there is a tidal cycle. It's just depending on kind of which parts of the water column their intake is sampling. See how am I doing time? That's some time. This is a slide that's intended to say, hey, we have a biogeochemical model. It's a little bit complicated. The important thing is that we're just modeling DIC and alkalinity and everything that goes into that. This is a video showing the flow inside of Swim Bay and the Strait of Juan de Fuca immediately outside of it. If you look at this for any length of time, you'll notice something, which is that there's really only one area where there's something crazy going on, and that's right at our point of release. And you can see these very long arrows, these kind of darker red colors indicate that there's a lot of flow through this narrow channel. This is no surprise to us. There's a reason Pacific Northwest National Laboratory Department of Energy Lab is located there. It's because they are there to study tidal energy. There's a huge tidal flux coming through there. But this means that if we ever do start releasing alkalinity to the bay, it's not going to stay there. It's going to very quickly mix either through the bay or out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So this is good and bad. Again, it's good because it means that we should be able to, in theory, release more alkalinity before we ever see an impact. But it's also bad from a scientific standpoint, and that our measurable signal, which already we've stated probably wasn't going to be measurable, is definitely not going to be measurable when there's two knot water flowing through there. So at least for the model simulations, we're looking at two different locations of release, because we don't actually have to release it where we model. So we're modeling where we're actually releasing the alkalinity, and we're also modeling what would happen if we released alkalinity out into the middle of swim bay, with the theory being that maybe the release out to the middle of swim bay would kind of spend more time within the bay and possibly accumulate to a greater degree. For each of those locations, we're also doing two simulations. The first set of simulations is what we're actually planning to do in terms of the magnitude of release. The second set of simulations is, let's pretend we did 1,000 times that. And 1,000 times that is approximately equivalent to what would happen if a wastewater treatment plant had started using this process, as some other field trials are attempting to do. And so it's looking at kind of the relative impacts of those two possible futures. This is a video of the mid-bay release, so not where we're actually doing it. And this is a video of the 1,000 times case. So 40 million gallons per day, 60 fire hoses going nonstop of relatively strong base right into this set of grid cells. The color is the alkalinity. The dark blues are indicating that the alkalinity is up to around 3,000 versus the natural background, which you're seeing is red or orange, right around 2,000. So you can see that it's doesn't really appear to be accumulating in the bay in a significant way. That bay is being flushed every 10 days. So you see a very strong signal right where there's a release, but further beyond, it's not really changing that whole bay into a blue haven of mitigated ocean acidification. This is a time series of that same idea. Right at the point of release, the experiment, the red simulation, shows a big difference from the control, the black simulation. But as you move further away here, it's only a very small difference in total alkalinity. Up top, you can't even see the two because they're both on top of each other. Up top is represented in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So this is suggesting that whatever impacts we are expecting to see, or the impacts that we're modeling, are suggesting that it's going to be very tough to measure against natural variability unless we're right here. Making that point a little bit further, this is the change in pH that we would expect in an annual average sense for these four different experiments. The color scale here, dark blue is representing almost a complete mitigation of ocean acidification. So here you can see that this is actually pretty strongly mitigating ocean acidification in annual average sense. But what we're planning to do, that's, you can't tell the difference. This is good and bad. I keep saying that. This is good because it means that we aren't as concerned about what impacts our field trial might have in terms of living marine resources and organisms and the people who live there. This is bad in the sense that we're not going to be able to detect the signal that we're hoping to detect. Okay, this is now the same plot, but for total dissolved inorganic carbon. The y-axis, or sorry, the color axis is now plus or minus 10. And so it's mostly showing the same thing. The point that we're making here is that because it takes 1 to 12 months to equilibrate, the dissolved inorganic carbon change is much, much smaller. Just that color range being only plus or minus 10 means that we're well below the natural variability in this bay. And actually, even this relatively large pH change in these simulations is, you might remember from several slides earlier, still well below the natural variability. Okay, we've had some progress with our species response studies. Our team focused on that, is looking at 3 different organisms: Taylor sea hare, eelgrass isopods, and Pacific oysters. The first 2 are really common prevalent species within Squim Bay, and the third is a very commercially important species that is kind of harvested within that region. Low on time, so I'll kind of move quickly. We've done a bunch of incubation experiments with each of these organisms exposed to a range of pHs. The pHs range from the control, which is just the seawater that we pump, up to a pH of 9.3. So that represents the most extreme. That's actually even further, it's higher pH than what we'd be releasing as pure product, if that makes sense. So this is really covering the full span of conditions. You might remember that in that plot showing the pH, it was really just right where you were releasing the base that we found that we had kind of pHs in this range. Pretty much everywhere else it was much closer to just the control. But this is a plot of mortality. And in each of these treatments, going from on the left, we have control, low pH or low impact, I guess, low alkalinity addition, medium, so 8.3, 8.8, 9.3. On the figure on the left, we have the sea hares, and they showed pretty clear evidence of increased mortality at the kind of extreme conditions, right where you're emitting or releasing that base. So in the most extreme case of 9.3 pH, 100% mortality. As you moved kind of closer to control conditions, it was much more normal. As far as the isopods, they seem to be somewhat unaffected up to about a pH of 8.3. And then after that, there seemed to be a clear indication of somewhat decreased survivorship. We're still looking at these data. We're holding off on publishing them because we're not 100% confident in them. But the oyster story is showing that for the first 3 treatments, no impact. It was, the oysters were perfectly happy with it. And then for the kind of extreme pH 9.3 treatment, it showed pretty significant mortality up to pH, 23 days in, they had 50% mortality. All right. I've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, the class actually goes till 10:05, so if you go over, it's okay.
Okay.
So,
No, I just got a handful of more.
yeah, that's great.
So this is trying to get at that last box that I had circled and haven't touched yet, which is the biotic calcification feedback. This is a plot of the alkalinity to salinity ratio on the x-axis, and on the y-axis you have depth. You don't need to worry about this. The main point that I'm making here is that as you move down throughout the water column, I'm sorry, this is data from the I-5 cruise in the Indian Ocean, which we just got off of last summer. It's not important that it's there. That was just the data that I had on hand. The point that I'm making here is, generally speaking, as you move throughout down through the ocean, the alkalinity in most places increases. The reason why is you have organisms that make their shells and hard parts out of calcium carbonate. They live their lives in the surface ocean, and then they die, sink, and release that alkalinity into the deep ocean. So there's a natural pump called the hard tissue pump of the alkalinity from the surface ocean into the ocean interior. And that tends to create this kind of natural gradient. That means that the surface ocean is naturally somewhat depleted in alkalinity relative to what it would be in the absence of these organisms. So for the biotic calcification, if this is the normal circumstance where you have these feedbacks between alkalinity and total carbon and saturation state of calcium carbonate, in a perturbed world with extra alkalinity added, you would expect that to result in an elevated omega, higher saturation state, and that would then exert a negative feedback on the alkalinity, because you are encouraging more organisms to make their shells and hard parts out of calcium carbonate, and therefore you are increasing that pump of alkalinity from the surface ocean where it can take up extra CO2 into the ocean interior. So that's the fear. And then the question is, to what degree is this a fear that we need to be concerned about? When we look at models, the models are pretty, well, I'll show this in a slide or two, but they really are very divergent in terms of how they model this impact and how large this impact is within the models. So one of the things that we wanted to ask is, could we see this in the real world data? And the reason we might be able to see this in the real world data is because we've kind of been running the reverse experiment for a very long time, where we're releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. That's driving the omega down. And then in theory, that should be decreasing the size of this negative feedback on the alkalinity. So in theory, the surface ocean alkalinity should be going up if omega matters. because of ocean acidification. Does that make sense? I did not explain that well at all. Should have practiced that one. Okay, anyways, yeah, so now the organisms are making smaller shells or fewer organisms. That pump in an ocean acidification world should have been diminished somewhat. So this is a modeling study showing what impact that might have on the alkalinity. This is showing that the surface ocean alkalinity you would expect to increase as less alkalinity is being pumped from the surface into the deep ocean. The deep ocean is a little bit more confusing as to what happens because in addition to having less alkalinity pumped into the deep ocean, you might also have more calcium carbonate in sediments being remineralized or dissolved because the ocean is becoming more corrosive with ocean acidification. So it's a little bit more of a question mark in the deep ocean, but the surface ocean, the alkalinity should be increasing if ocean acidification is having this impact. So then the question is, can we see this in the measurements? This is the period of time over which we actually have repeat hydrographic measurements from like 1990s to the present day. And this is now getting into Reese Barrett's work. Well, sorry, actually this slide is me making the point that the models really don't agree on what the alkalinity should be doing in the surface ocean. That last slide was just one model. If you look across the CMIP6 models, and if you take them all and squish them together so that they're all the same value here, I think the year 2000, then you see that they're kind of going both up and down. And that's because the models can't agree on how to parameterize ocean acidification and whether or not to include this feedback. So we have first order questions on this feedback in the models, and we don't really know how to handle it. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. Now, on to Reese's work, the question is can we actually see a trend in the alkalinity, which might help us figure out which of the model world we actually live in? And these are her kind of most recent results, really cool stuff. Working from repeat hydrography, again, from the 1990s to the present day. If you subtract off an algorithm estimate that is intended to remove the impacts of natural variability, and then plot that over time, you get this. And this is a two-dimensional histogram where the darker colors indicate more data points. The punchline here is with the right regressions, you can show that there's a very, very slight positive increase. It's very tough to see. You have to go through a bunch of sensitivity analyses and uncertainty analyses, which Reese has done to figure out what kind of uncertainty we have on this. She's also explored a bunch of alternative hypotheses. Ask her about it. She's still doing that work. It's really cool. But the punchline is over these 30 years or so, there's been about 2.5 micromoles per kilogram of alkalinity increase in the surface ocean. That actually matches up quite well with the increase that we saw over the same period in there. So the suggestion there, we got to back up here. The suggestion there is that we do live in a world where ocean acidification matters. And if ocean acidification matters, then maybe this is actually a negative feedback on ocean alkalinity enhancement. How big of a negative feedback on ocean alkalinity enhancement? We don't really know. And so Kelly Carney is leading research, modeling research to figure out how much uncertainty we have in that. These are some back of the envelope calculations that they did with just the simplest Earth system model you can imagine. It's like 50 lines of code. And it suggests that if you make some really grotesque assumptions and look over very long periods of time, I cut off the x-axis here, but these are thousands of years. Then you find that this feedback is something on the order of 15%. So first order questions in this, we need to do a lot of modeling to figure this out. And that's the kind of research that's being spun out there. Okay, takeaways from the whole presentation. First up, lab and modeling experiments so far do not give us any reason to doubt that ocean alkalinity enhancement electrochemical methods could work. The air-sea gas exchange seems to be indicating that it would mostly happen before that water lost contact with the atmosphere. We've now made the base from seawater. We've done some flow-through trials already, and field trials are coming soon, both with our research and a number of other research projects. I would argue that safety and social license are very critical questions to address, and it's one of the things that's going to kind of pump the brakes on all these field trials and a lot of the optimism, and for good reason. The biotic calcification feedback seems to be working. We seem to live in a world where ocean acidification matters, and but we don't quite know what impact that would have on the ocean alkalinity enhancement efficiency or efficacy. I would argue from the basis of those back of the envelope calculations that probably 15%-ish, but still no good question. Last conclusion is that if you ever use the phrase, any of those times work fine, then you're gonna end up having to go first. Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so take questions, but I want to remind students enrolled in the class that I want you to log on and do a seminar reflection that's open now until 5:20. So that's sort of my way, making sure you're showing up and paying attention. It could be a question, a confusion, or a comment. Wow, this is all scary, or whatever. But let's take some questions.
I was curious for the organisms that were kind of tested with the different pH levels. Were they exposed to those levels just like constantly, or and for how long?
Yeah, so the first answer is no, and they were allowed to kind of incubate in their own juices for 12 hours at a time, and then the water would be flushed again. Does that make sense?
I think so.
And during that time, the PCO2 did change and meaningfully because of their respiration. So that's one big question mark for that study. Yeah, Herman.
It's sometimes lower than from the experiment.
0.04 million gallons per day. I don't know what that means. Yeah, Joe.
If you aerate your effluent, how fast does it change CO2 and how quickly can you decrease the pH, something that's more acceptable?
Yeah, one of our recent experiments was putting a bubbler stone in there and just really going hard with the bubbles. And with that, it took about 4 days still. We do think that you could be more efficient about that with like a thin film recirculating thing, but it seems like it's going to take a while regardless. And it takes a lot of energy to do that, of course. Yeah.
I think the technique works like a well integrated as well, so I'm just imagining how many this kind of facility we need really, which I'll go up to the three.
Yeah, so to get 20 gigatons of carbon, how many of the ones that you saw there? So the ones that you saw in the picture, that's the 0.04 million gallons per day. So then multiply that by a factor of 1,000, so 1,000 times those. Then you're at 40 million gallons per day. Then you probably need to multiply that by, if I remember correctly from the Hongji's paper has an answer to your question. I think it was like 6,700 of those 1,000 unit things approximately.
Do you have like ideal location for this kind of facility, like in terms of seawater chemistry?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions about that, and it depends on what you're trying to optimize. The rate of air-to-sea gas exchange, we think might be faster in some locations than others due to winds, due to the mixed layer depth, due to initial seawater chemistry. The other concern is some people, Seaworthy has a lot of research ongoing about this, are showing that it's actually more efficient if you site it in some locations rather than others. The issue is that the efficiency that you get, it depends on the initial carbonate chemistry. It tends to be more efficient the higher the PCO2 is of the water that you put it in. But that efficiency actually changes over time as that water leaves, and if it like were to move from that circuit, so let's say you added a lot of alkalinity to a high PCO2 area, and then that water kind of advects around it and ends up in the lower PCO2 area. When the processes happen that change the PCO2, it will actually lose that extra efficiency as well. So Seaworthy is also trying to convolve this with the point at which it loses contact with the atmosphere as well. So it's interesting. Yeah, Nick.
To that point, could you define what you mean when you say in contact with the atmosphere? Because obviously you're not talking about stuff centimeter.
Yeah.
And estimates for how long that might persist.
Yeah, I would argue just within the mixed layer. But you know, the closer you look at the mixed layer, the more it disappears and the more it becomes a very complicated thing. So I don't have a perfect answer for your question, but I think within the mixed layer is good enough. The but though, is that when you look purely within the mixed layer, then you get that 1 to 12 month answer, which is what there's a study that was asking how long it does take for the mixed layer to equilibrate. The challenge is that it can lose contact with the atmosphere when it gets left behind by the shoaling of a deep wintertime mixed layer. But that doesn't mean it's out of the game. It can still be swept back into the next layer the next summer, or the next winter, sorry. So it ends up being more of a continuum of time scales. And that's why often the best answer is, rather than just doing a straight answer of 40% or something like that, you plug it into a model. And that's the seaworthy approach as well, is take your best guess, put it into a model and see what you get. Yeah.
And Spoon Bay looks like a good location for a pilot study. What's the natural or background PCO2 in Spoon Bay?
Really high. Let's see, I got so I didn't talk about it, but the blue is the background environment. We've got one of our ASV CO2 Gen 1 systems on the intake. You can see it goes from just about the atmospheric value all the way up to 1,300 parts per million.
I can't read any of that.
Yeah, 1,300. It can get really, really high, but the average value is probably closer to
It's
800.
like Friday Harbor Lab.
Is that comparable with Friday Harbor?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Is there a goal to have the carbon dioxide buyout eventually connect to OA mitigation? Would OA mitigation be something that companies could find into?
I would like that feature, but I have heard no person with money talk about that feature. So. Yeah, that was a point with the early conversations about CNATE. One of the philanthropies, the Grantham Foundation, was really interested in the air-sea gas exchange question. And I was on a call with them and they said, well, if you don't get carbon dioxide removal because of air-sea gas exchange, you still get ocean acidification mitigation. That's gotta be worse. Something like that. No.
So, we had Matt Long from Seaworthy coming,
Yeah.
the last seminar. So,
Should be good one.
another question?
So if, like, based on your last statement, if the sea air gas exchange, like, is proven to like not work, then ocean acidification could be addressed, but if it does work, like, ocean acidification could never be addressed without, like, increasing the alkalinity of the ocean.
Well, so there's two answers to that. One's because of the differential of timescales, as I think the way I phrased it before is you do get to have your cake before you eat it. And so if you're wanting to very locally mitigate ocean acidification, in theory, if you have an enclosed embayment or some particular body of water that you care about, you could do that there. As far as globally, it would be pretty yeah, and then it's either or really. The but to that is that if you add alkalinity to the seawater, the pH goes way up and then it comes back down, but it doesn't actually go down as far as to where you started. It goes close, but it's got about, I'm forgetting the fraction, but it's like about 10 to 15% off of that bottom. So in theory, if you ever were to solve atmospheric CO2 with ocean alkalinity enhancement, then you will have perturbed the ocean chemistry to such an extent that you will have also mitigated ocean acidification in an equal way. To say nothing of the fact that you will have brought down the atmospheric value, and that also inherently mitigates ocean acidification.
What is like the timeline of like this ongoing research on like the impacts of alkalinity enhancement and like actually deployment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the timeline is different for every study there's many different studies that have been funded under various proposals. I think there's one that's starting soon within the next year. Anyone know when Loch Ness is starting? I don't. Reese is nodding. It's in next year. Okay. For ours, within the next year, we're hoping to start releasing CO2 or alkalinity. But we might not. And we're not gonna call that a failure if we don't, because if we're not, that means that we don't feel it's safe or ready yet.
Sorry, a follow-up question. You said that PNNL lab is like focusing on tidal energy and that. And really, you think that tidal energy could be used to power like the electric atoms?
Yeah, that's one thing that we think could be really neat about this, which is that imagine that future where that green curve has been realized and we have a tremendous, our whole grid has been decarbonized. Let's imagine wind, because that's kind of easier to imagine, or actually no, tidal is fine. So we've managed to generate a tremendous amount of electricity through these conventional strategies. They might be producing a large amount of electricity when we don't need it. When the tides are high, maybe it's just in the middle of the night and nobody needs energy at that time. This could be a really excellent sink, we think, for all that extra energy. Like, okay, we've got extra energy, let's put it into electrodialysis and seawater. And then once people wake up and they turn their heaters on, we can click that back off. We think, but we need to put the system on this is one really neat thing that the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories has, is that they have an electricity supply that simulates kind of renewable energy profiles. So they're going to try putting the EB system on that and seeing whether it kind of self-destructs. Open up.
Right, well, let's thank Brendan again. That your seminar reflects.